Good morning, everybody. I'm not entirely sure if I can't see.
Oh yeah, there's people coming in. I can see them.
Can you see that? Can you see? Excellent, excellent. Oh yes, we can see participants. Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, great. Well, look, welcome everybody. Good morning. I see some familiar faces, not faces, but names there. We're just having a little issue, as we always seem to have, with our LinkedIn live feed. So I'm slightly buying time here, but we will get started, and I'm sure that will be sorted. So as those of you that know the People Experience Hub may know me, Rob Robson. I'm our Director of People Science. The webinar really is not about me, though. I'd like to welcome our guest today, who's Suzanne Evans. Suzanne, Dr. Suzanne Evans.
I'll just log off if you don't call me that.
Yeah, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Morning, Rob. Hi, everybody. I can see a few names that I recognise, so it's nice to see you. As Rob says, I'm Suzanne. My area of work is in organisation change and transformation and development, and I use a lot of storytelling in my work. So I started off in Big Four consulting, doing change projects, and really noticed how hard some of these things were sometimes. It was really difficult to build engagement in the change. And so started using stories, I suppose, through a project that I did, gosh, it must be about 14 years ago now. Saw how stories made a difference to the way that people engage with change, and so embarked on a journey of my own learning and development and research, looking at storytelling through change projects, which led me to getting a PhD in 2020. So now all my work is on supporting organisations through change, often using stories, and so I'm really excited today to be here to talk to you about storytelling and how it can build engagement in all contexts, not just in periods of change and transformation.
Okay, brilliant. I mean, I'd really love to hear a little bit more about your journey into your PhD as well, and how, and I suppose how that, you know, we can all relate to our stories, right? It's sort of an obvious statement, but I'm kind of interested in exploring what you mean by storytelling as a more deliberate practice, and what you learned about that, you know, in your PhD.
Well, I'll go back a few years, because the project that got me into this in the first place was with an organisation that was starting to introduce a new strategy, and they'd kind of done the usual thing, which I'm sure will be very familiar to people on this call, where the board go off and have an away day and then develop the strategy, and then somebody develops some PowerPoint slides that explain the strategy. And in a normal circumstance, that's how the strategy would be communicated. You know, there'd be a town hall meeting and everyone will go in, listen to the slides, and then go away again, and that's how it would be rolled out. And this particular organisation had thought, do you know what, we're going to do this differently. And they, having come up with this PowerPoint pack of the strategy, they then went off and got each of the execs to create their own take, I suppose, their own story about this strategy. And I was involved in organising this training for them to go off and do this learning. And so I witnessed how they went from having this strategy document in front of them to working with it and understanding it, and then being able to tell the story of this strategy in their own words, in a way that made sense to them and in a way that made sense to their own team. And it was based a lot on the work of Noel Tichy, who does leadership point of view and teachable point of view. And the basis of that is, if you tell somebody something in a way that is exciting to you and you're engaged in it, then other people will become more engaged too, and you use the story to do that. So that was kind of my jumping off point into story, but I kind of filed that away as, oh, well, that was interesting, and then didn't do anything with it for a couple of years. But I realised in organisations I was working with around change, you've got the kind of story, the deliberate story that's created around what needs to change, but then there's all the other stories going on too that are not necessarily listened to or collected during a change programme, but actually they can really unhinge the progress of anything that happens, because they're kind of there bubbling around in the background. And so I realised so much of around change is around advocating the change, why this is a good idea, why we need to do this. Look at this change, everything's going to be amazing when this change has been implemented. But there wasn't a lot of activity around inquiring into what people were saying and what people were feeling. And often that kind of noise around change was badged as being resistance. And actually, I started to realise, well, it isn't really, is it? It's a form of engagement. It's just perhaps not the engagement that we want to see.
Yep.
So my research was really focused on going into organisations that were doing change and trying to listen to some of these other stories that were out there, not the official stories, and seeing what we could do with that. And what I found out was, if you give people an opportunity to get involved and engaged in anything, and the opportunity to tell their story and be listened to, it makes a massive difference to taking people with you on anything that's different. So my research was really focused on gathering those stories, looking at themes, and then seeing what that tells us about the organisation. And really that's led into the work that I do today, which is about helping organisations make more use of storytelling, both as a means of communication, but also as a means of understanding what's going on in the organisation.
I mean, that's really interesting, because I don't think I've ever really worked. I've worked in a lot of change programs. I've been around the block, got the grey hair for it, and I don't think I've ever worked with storytelling sort of explicitly, certainly as any kind of a method. I notice Liz Edward-Smith, an old colleague of mine from our Atos days, is in the audience, and we used to use things like called rich pictures, which were a visual representation of the vision that people could talk. So I suppose there's elements of that. Liz. But I'm really interested in hearing that it's not just about telling the story behind the vision, and not just about telling, but actually using stories to understand and to hear what people have to say, and to understand all those different perspectives. That's really interesting to me, because I'm pretty new to this as a thing. So what does it, what is the relationship then to engagement, and I'm really interested in, I think, what you've talked as part of it, I guess, a little bit more about your approach and what that is, because I think when we've talked before, you talked about things like history and identity and stuff. I'm really interested in that, and I think because that's what made me really think about belonging. So maybe that's the next point, is can you talk a little bit about what your approach to storytelling to you, and those relationships with engagement, belonging, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned rich pictures, because I think when you think about story, we often think about a verbal story or something with words, but actually visual storytelling is really important as well. So I might come back to that a bit later, but a story is more than just a telling, a verbal thing. It's pictures and images are really important too. In terms of the history, I kind of had a feeling about this for a while, but my PhD research really made me think that there's a lot going on in organisations under the surface that often on change projects I worked on, we just didn't touch. It was all forward looking. This is where we are, this is where we need to get to, and how are we going to get there? But actually, all the stuff that's happened before, it has an impact on how fast we can move in the future and where we can go. And a lot of the stories that I heard in organisations that I was working with were things in the past that perhaps had led people to behave in a certain way, or had led to certain expectations. I think we probably all joined an organisation or a team and heard stories about someone or something that happened in the past. And it could have been years and years ago, but we hear it because it's part of the identity and the history of that team. And all of that needs to be considered, because it impacts on how we can move forward. It almost acts like an anchor, I think. And unless that stuff's been surfaced and dealt with, it's really difficult to move forward. And a particular example of that I like to share is an organisation I was working with. They were creating change, and they hadn't done much change before. They were quite an old organisation, and they were closing some offices down. And this was the first time in their history that they had ever made anybody redundant. So this was a big deal. And they did a really long process, loads of consultation. They did it really slowly, moving at the pace of the organisation. So they made the announcement, and then there was about a year between when the announcement was made and when people were actually going to be made redundant. And people were just kind of left to get on with it and close the office down. And in this particular office, they had Christmas, they put all the Christmas decorations up. Then they took the decorations down and they put them in a box under the stairs in this office, with the anticipation that they were going to donate them to a local hospital when the office closed. Well, the person who was going to do that left, and so it never happened. And the decorations sat there, and 3 or 4 months went by. And a story started to circulate about how, well, because of the decorations still being under the stairs, the office wasn't actually going to close, that the senior people had changed their mind about the office closure because the decorations were still there. But this story was only talked about in the office. It was never shared with anyone else. So when HR arrived a few months later to start doing the consultation, individual consultations, and give people their notice and their redundancy calculations, all hell broke loose because people thought they weren't going to be made redundant because of this thing that had happened and the story that had been told. And the first time I heard that story, it was really interesting to me because I thought, well, actually, if someone had been listening to that story beyond the people who were telling it to each other, some action could have been taken and a lot of heartache and stress could have been resolved. So for me, that was the moment when I thought, you know what, we need, as change practitioners and as HR people, we need to be paying attention to these things that we're hearing. Even if they seem a bit weird and a bit stupid, it's still, people will be talking about it, and we need to understand what that means and take some action as a result of it. So this history and things that have gone before, it's important to get underneath that before you get started in creating any change or any engagement. Actually, you know, what has gone before? What is it that people will be feeling? You know, we talk about change fatigue, we talk about engagement fatigue. I suspect is probably a thing, or not another survey. You know, well, all of that is telling you something about how people are feeling.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we're you know, obviously we're a survey company. And that's what we do. But that what you're describing there, that story really plays to the idea that, you know, to properly listen to your people, to properly understand your people, you need to use a range of methods, and informal, formal, qualitative, quantitative. And your survey is part of the picture, but it's only part of the picture, isn't it?
Yeah, Nancy Duart, I think, talks about doing listening tours, that every leader should do listening tours. And it's the kind of old concept, I suppose, of management by walking about, which is, you know, you just wander around and see what you see. But leaders, and it goes back to my point about advocacy and inquiry, leaders need to be inquiring about what's going on in the organisation, as well as advocating about what's coming. And I think if we all spent a bit more time wandering around and listening to things, it would make a huge difference to the way organisations operate. There's a lot of talk in organisations, but not a lot of listening, I don't think.
And I suppose that's challenging for a lot of leaders, isn't it? It sounds like an easy thing to do, but actually, intellectually, it's an easy thing to do, but emotionally, probably challenging for a lot of leaders, and not necessarily going to hear everything that they want to hear.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot of fear sometimes in leaders. It goes back to the point around resistance, that a fear of things being complicated, or, as you say, hearing something they don't want to hear, or dealing with emotions. You know, no one wants that, but actually we should be okay with that. You know, if you're expecting people to move with you, you have to be prepared as a leader to accept that you might not always hear what you want to hear. I can see that John Bartlett is on the call, and he told me a great story the other day about a leader that he had worked with who did a town hall discussion and actually invited questions from the audience and asked anyone to ask anything that they wanted, which is so unusual. You know, I've been to loads of those town hall meetings where questions have to be submitted in advance, whereas in this case, the leader said, ask me anything. And actually, people started asking him how much he was paid and how could he justify that pay. And he took it on the chin. And actually, that created an environment of trust and of engagement, which would never have been created if that leader hadn't been so prepared to be open and honest about where they were at.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, you know, it is complex. We are emotional. You might as well just accept that and start, you know, and start from that premise. So you talked there about history more, and I'm really interested in exploring a little bit more about you know, the identity part as well, and because for me, the belonging part of engagement, and you know, are we talking about engagement as a you know, as a construct, as a thing? I think I mean this in the more general sense, in the more holistic way. I think belonging is fundamentally about identity, and I think belonging is, you know, belonging for me is a really important part of an overall experience. It's not the be all and end all, but in a world for me that is changing, that requires people to come on a, you know, in an organization often on a difficult journey, you know, and to trust the leadership and go on that journey with them. It's really important. So yeah, the whole thing about identity that you, because you've talked to me about this before, and I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, and I think the story is the key here, because within any organization, there's multiple levels of belonging and identity. And, you know, you have a feeling of belonging to the organization that you work for, but then there'll also be a feeling of belonging in a particular group or a particular team, or even with a particular individual that you work closely with. And a lot of that is related to the stories that are told and the past experiences. So it's all linked together, the idea of having a history. And some of that can be related to work stuff, but often it isn't. And the stories that you hear in organisations that are told about when people felt that they were part of the team, it's often other things. I've heard so many stories over the years about, you know, having breakfast together as a team, and how when that was taken away in an organisation because they didn't cook breakfast anymore, it caused all kinds of problems. And so I think you create that sense of identity and belonging through shared experience. And going back to what I said at the beginning about, you know, that sense of history and telling stories of things that happened possibly even before you joined an organisation, all of that is part of the identity and belonging. And so we get that even if we're not there. You know, things are talked about that happened perhaps before you even joined an organisation, but all of that is part of creating a sense of identity and belonging. I can see that Rob's frozen, so I'll just keep talking. He's disappeared. Naomi, shall I just carry on talking?
Go for it.
Or Liz, you're saying this resonates with your current situation. Stories, yeah, exactly. So having these shared stories are really important. And I did a piece of work a while ago with a client, and it was with a team, and they were going through some quite difficult times. And when I started speaking to them, they started telling me all these stories about stuff that had happened. And they were all telling me the same stories. But actually, when I started to just kind of delve more into those stories, we discovered that a lot of those things, I'm just talking, Rob, I'm just carrying on. A lot of those things had happened way before these people had joined, like 5-10 years before people had joined the organisation. And yet they were telling these stories as though they were there. So this creation of identity and belonging, it goes right back to all sorts of things. You see it in organisations like Dyson and Patagonia and things have a really strong company story and they tell that as part of induction and all of that sort of thing, but actually there's more to it than that, and it's in the team as well. And I love, John, you saying industrial memory. I think that's exactly it, that organizations have memory, and we ignore it at our peril, because it's really important to take note of it.
It can be really powerful, can't it? I mean, I remember, you know, when I was at Tata, I was, you know, a relative newcomer, but I still ended up as part of the leadership team being quite steeped in the stories, and it was really interesting to me, because those stories, the positive stories, were very much around, you know, kind of battling, delivering against the odds, you know, just making things happen, that entrepreneurial spirit of you know, a growing company. And actually the other side of that was the chaos, the, you know, things not really working well, the fact that we'd messed up a client engagement in the first place and had to pull it out of the bag, all that sort of stuff was in the background. But the stories we told were of the can-do spirit and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, and I felt, you know, as part of that group, I did almost feel like I'd been there, but I hadn't, you know.
It's really weird. And actually what you say about adversity, that's a really important point when it comes to stories, because we engage more with stories if they create some form of emotion in us.
Yeah.
And you think about any film or book that really grabs you, and there will be a kind of an arc, you know, like a story arc, where, you know, there's good stuff happens, then a bad thing happens, and then at the end it's resolved. And I think those types of stories of coming through adversity are the ones that really bond people into teams. And I think if you're thinking about using story in any form of work, it's really important to have that emotion, because otherwise it's just a list of things that happened.
Yeah.
It's really important to create emotion, and to see that there's challenges, and to be really honest about those.
Yeah, I you know, there's a little bit of text chat there about, you know, sometimes those stories are positive and sometimes negative, and that, you know, even that positive element of, you know, pulling it out of the bag, dealing with adversity, you know, there is that, you know, suggests there's a lack of willingness to plan well, and it's and I suppose that's the bit about managing the narrative. We hear this all the time now in the media, don't we? Managing the narrative, and that's the deliberate part, I suppose, when it is about trying to pull out the stories that actually, you know, that actually help you as a business.
Yeah, and I think part of that is identifying them, first of all, and second is to make use of the ones that are going to help. And I think, as I mentioned, Patagonia and Dyson, other companies are really good at doing that. Be really interested to hear from people on the call, you know, their own companies, their own experiences of things that they think have worked really well, and companies that are really good at this stuff, but they have a strong creation story, but then they also have strong stories that support what it is that they're trying to do. So an organization I've been working with for a while, they introduced a big way in the way they were working, and it was kind of post-COVID, but actually they were going to do it before anyway. And they went from being office-based to being hybrid all the time, so people can choose where they want to work, when they want to work. And this represented quite a change from a traditional 9-to-5 office thing to actually people having a lot more autonomy. And they could have just done, and they did do, you know, workshops and discussions and slide packs and all that, explaining what this was going to be like. But then they also did some cartoons to describe what somebody's working day would be like in this new world. And it told the story of 3 real life people in the organization and how their day was going to be different. And I think it's about building that picture of the world that you're trying to create. And you can do that through visual storytelling, you can do it through stories, you can do it through normal communications, but doing lots of different things together is a really good way of building that rich picture for people. And that's what gets people engaged and will take them with you.
Yeah, and that you know, telling that story through the eyes of even fictional characters is quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's fundamentally a different experience to if that story is being told or if the information is the same, this is what it will look like. This is what you'll do on a daily basis. This is how things will happen. But seeing it through the eyes of a person creates that emotion, doesn't it? And that you were talking about emotion being important, and you know, as you know, emotions something that very close to my heart. But it's that, how do you go about, you know, what some good examples for you about that, building that emotionality into the stories?
I think it's about being really honest and authentic about what's to come. So I'm working with an organisation at the moment to enable their execs to have the strategy, but then to tell the story of that strategy. And I've said to all of them, if there are challenges ahead, then we need to talk about those. And you know, I'm sure you've been in this experience, Rob. I'm sure other people on this call will too, where leaders are sometimes unwilling to talk about what's difficult or what they don't know. And they want to give this kind of impression that it's all going to be amazing and it's all been thought about and every possible eventuality has been considered. Well, of course it hasn't. You know, that's not real life. So part of it, I think, is being really honest and upfront with people about, do you know what, this thing is going to be difficult, and so and let's be really honest about that, about the difficult times. And I think to acknowledge them when they happen and to acknowledge them when you think they might happen is really powerful. So instead of just doing the sort of, you know, everything's awesome and it's all going to continue to be awesome type presentation, do something that's a bit more authentic and be real about what's going to happen.
Which really taps in, for me, that really taps into vulnerability. And vulnerability is, I suppose, a close bedfellow of empathy as well. And do you see certain types of, you know, leaders being attracted to this sort of thing, and do you see the impact? Do you see leaders changing as a result of this sort of thing? Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Andy, in the comments, you're absolutely right. It's honesty, authenticity, and vulnerability are absolutely the keys. Some leaders absolutely love this stuff, and when I appear in an organisation to talk to them about storytelling, are biting my hand off to do it. And actually, a lot of them are already doing it. It's about then honing their skills. Some people are really afraid of doing it because they are not comfortable with revealing something of themselves, or taking the risk of opening up a discussion or opening up a conversation. And I think that is difficult. And you do see change with people, but it's about then building their confidence. I think a big thing with storytelling is some people think they're not very good at telling stories. They don't see themselves as an entertainer. And they have that view in their mind that you have to be some kind of great raconteur to tell a story, and you don't. We all tell stories all the time, but somehow when we go into work, we sometimes switch that part of us off. And I bet all of us, if you think about the last time you met up with friends or family, a big part of the conversation would be sharing stories about things that had happened. You know, you think about when you go to a pub, it's all just chatting about stories, but somehow we forget all that when we go to work, and we all have to become serious and, you know, businesslike. And actually it's about switching that bit on. And I think with people who find it hard, it's baby steps. So it's introducing an element of storytelling, maybe adding your own personal anecdote to an existing presentation and moving from there. So it's taking it at the speed that people feel comfortable with.
Yeah, and that also speaks to me about helping people access a mindset that they do have access to, but they often will leave behind at the door, as it were.
They do, and I think it's practice as well. So when I work with leaders to develop their own stories, we do loads of practice. We start off with getting them to tell their own leadership story, because that's easier, because that's just about them, and it's about, you know, how have you ended up where you are now, and who are your influences and that sort of thing. Before you then move on to telling a story about something corporate that is sort of a bit separate from you. I think it's just practice, write it down, practice it yourself with a friendly audience, get feedback, and just gradually start building it into your practice, so that if you're you have a presentation to give, is there a way that you can build in a little anecdote or a little story that illustrates the point that you're trying to make, and just build up to it gradually. But it isn't about being a great entertainer. It is exactly as Andy said, about being really honest and authentic and revealing something of yourself. That's all it is.
Yeah, and conflict, you know, when with any personal risk, confidence is important, and taking and recognizing the small steps you can take to build that confidence. So you were talking about the arc, and I think that's a, you know, again, something that's quite interesting, because successful or you know, powerful stories tend to have a certain structure about them, don't they?
They do, and there's some great stuff out there to help if you're interested in doing any of this. The classic is the story arc, which is kind of, you start with, you set the context, something happens, then something goes wrong, and then it's resolved at the end. And so you can search for story arc online. The Pixar story spine is another classic. I mean, Pixar are just masters of storytelling. There's loads of stuff out there online about that you can look at. It follows a similar trajectory. But the key in all of this is to have that kind of roller coaster of emotion, so that you're engaged straight away. You know, that whenever you tell a story, you can tell it's a story because it's set in a time and a place. So someone will start the story off with, oh, about 10 years ago, or I was working in so and so. That's how you know a story's about to come. And so that's the scene setting. Then you describe what's going to happen. Then there's a bit that goes wrong, or something that's, you know, you're not sure it's going to work out, and then at the end it's resolved. And that's the kind of classic way of structuring things. And so it's what I tend to use when I'm trying to, certainly around strategy. You know, what's the context of this strategy? What problem is it here to try and solve? What is it? What might go wrong? And then what's going to happen at the end? What are you as a leader excited about? And if you think about that kind of structure in any communications you're trying to do, then that's quite helpful. I saw that Liz earlier in the notes was saying about using cartoons to bring life to new ways of working. I think that, you know, that's a really good way of doing it too, you know, enliven what you're trying to talk about with some interesting images. There's a great book called Presentation Zen, which I use all the time around creating really interesting presentations. So think not just about the words, but also about the images that you're using when you communicate.
Yeah, yeah. And that arc, is that's similar to the concept of the hero's journey, right? It's a similar thing. Yeah,
I love the hero's journey. It's a bit complicated, but it's the similar sort of thing. I mean, it's, you know, there's always the joke that there's only two stories in the world. One is a stranger arrives, and two is that someone goes on a journey, and that's the basic story premise of most books and films. But the hero's journey, if people aren't familiar with it, is exactly that. You know, someone goes on a quest, they meet challenges along the way, and then they resolve the challenges, they get the treasure, and then they come home to a hero's welcome. And that's the classic story arc. Star Wars is the classic hero's journey. Thanks, John, for sharing that. Harry Potter too, yeah, very much. I mean, it's, you know, so many very famous film directors and writers have been influenced by the hero's journey.
We should, I mean, if we know that, we should all be all great novelists or film, you know, script writers, shouldn't we? But so, I mean, how did you, a question came in from Debbie about working with in hybrid working and remote working. How is your work? How are you finding it in that environment?
Hi Debbie, haven't seen you for ages. It's challenging. I think for all of us, it's about a more deliberate practice, I think. So I found over the last couple of years, you can still get this stuff, but you have to make a real effort to do it. So it's having in Zoom conversations or team meetings, getting people to talk about something interesting that's happened to them recently, or an incident that's stuck in their mind. I found if you ask people to tell a story, they clam up, because it goes into that kind of fear again about, oh, I'm not very good at this. So I found a good way to elicit stories is to actually ask people to talk about something that was interesting. Tell me something interesting that's happened to you in the last week, or something that's stuck in your mind, or whatever. And then you'll start to elicit this stuff. But it is a lot more deliberate practice that you'll have to work on to do it.
And presumably that's something that's interesting to them, because you as soon as you start to say, tell me something interesting that's going to be of interest to me, that's a different response, doesn't it?
No, indeed. And actually that's what's most important, is if it's interesting to them, that's cool. You know, it doesn't have to be interesting to everybody else. It's just interesting to them, or give you an insight into where they're at.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's great. And then and so back to sort of the engagement, you talked about the fact that it needs to be emotional, that comes through authenticity and honesty, and I can completely relate to that. The one thing I have come across is leadership teams start doing seeing some storytelling coming from a leadership team and thinking, yeah, this is bullshit, you know. It comes over very quickly, doesn't it, when it's not authentic. But what else are you using? You know, what other sort of interesting kind of ideas and frameworks are you using to inform your work in storytelling?
So I think certainly when I'm trying to get people to think about communicating about change, I really like the David Rock model, SCARF, which is just brilliant. I shall wave his book at you so you can see it, Your Brain at Work. And he's come up with this model of things to think about when people are going through change, and various reactions that people might have to change because of the impact it will have on these things. So it's status, it's certainty, it's around, I'm going to have to remind myself of the different elements of the model now because it's gone out of my head.
Security, fairness.
Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So those are the 5 things. And so when I'm working with organisations to get them to think about how to communicate a change in particular, if you're able to think about those things in your communications and make sure that you touch on those, either, well, probably actually in both the big corporate, the big context, the big conversation about what's happening at an organisation level, but then get teams to think about what it means for them. And I've done work before where we did all the kind of big corporate stuff, you know, the big messages, but we then took it down to individual teams, and I went round and chatted to them and got them to think about these things for them, because if you don't hit those points, people are going to start to have a reaction to the change, an emotional reaction, and it might mean they then switch off and disengage. So I think with any form of communication, we've always taught to think about what's in it for me, and I think that's fine, but what's in it for me is more than just that. You know, there's a lot of things at play. So I really like that model and often use that in communicating changes. I think it would apply to talking about engagement as well. So if you're thinking about the sort of classic, you know, you told us this and we went off and did this, you know, supermarket, you said we did model of feeding back on feedback. But actually, if you can think about that more broadly and think about the impact on people, I think that's quite important.
Yeah, I mean, I always advocate, you know, if you're a manager and you're talking about, you know, you see your results from your employee survey, you not talk about the scores, but to use the scores as a stimulus for discussion. So, okay, what do you think's behind this? What does this mean to you as a team? Because, you know, that survey, that question behind the survey, it's an approximation. It's, you know, we can only ask so many questions about so many things, and, you know, what people want to tell you is possibly that little bit different to what you're actually asking. And I think I've seen it in change programs, and I think it's the same thing when you're dealing with sort of engagement, is that just asking people, it is so powerful, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times over the years I've been, you know, had that conversation where there's an issue or a problem, and I've just said, well, have you spoken to them about this? And they will say no. And you think, well, there we go. You know, that is the start of the process. We just need to be having more conversations, and really honest conversations in organisations about all of this. And I think delving into the data and what it tells us is so much more important than the data itself. I found when I was doing my own research, I was in the same organisation for 3 years, meeting with groups of people to talk about what was happening. And I could see how their level of engagement in the organisation changed over that 3 years. Yeah. I met with them every 6 weeks. And sometimes they absolutely loved the organisation and what was going on. And sometimes they absolutely hated it. But they were engaged because they were engaged enough to come along to talk to me every 6 weeks about what was going on. And they were still doing their jobs. But their kind of feeling about the organisation really changed. And I called it at the time this kind of falling in and out of love with the organisation. And they did, because of what was happening at different times. And so I think the score is an entry point into that. But actually, if you've done the survey again in 6 months' time, it could be completely different because people could be feeling completely different.
Yeah, I mean, and that does that. It does depend on what you ask, but
Yeah.
when you, and it's one of the problems we see with stuff that is so instantaneous. You know, how are you feeling today? What's going on for you right now? Well, that, you know, by the time someone's seen that, it's gone. You know,
Yeah.
I feel great today, thanks. You know, or I feel terrible. So what? It's, you know, that moment has passed, and the way we feel, emotions are so so transitionary. You know, they're always on the move, and that's where we have to actually be careful about what we ask and when we ask it. Very different if you're doing an annual survey, for example, versus doing a little pulse. You might respond to much more quickly. Or if you're going to ask someone, how are you feeling right now, you need to be able to provide that support. But I think it's, you know, that bit about actually talking to people about those, you know, whether it's the results, whether it's about something that's happening, whether it's about an upcoming change, whatever it happens to be, is again a thing that managers, you know, are often very uncomfortable with, and it sort of shows itself as a bias towards action, isn't it? And so we've got these results right now. Right, what are we going to do about it? What are we action? Let's record some actions. I feel comfortable, but if we record some actions, and then we put some dates on them, and then we've done our job. I've done my management thing. But actually having those conversations is really critical, isn't it?
And I think the word uncomfortable is really important there, because it is sometimes this stuff is uncomfortable. But as leaders and managers, we have to be okay with that. You know, I'll get on my hobby horse about difficult conversations. You know, it's not difficult, it's just uncomfortable. And we have to be okay with being uncomfortable. And sometimes, exactly as you say, asking a question feels a lot more uncomfortable than presenting an answer. But it's really important that we do that, to dig underneath what's going on in organisations, so that we know what we're dealing with, rather than, as you say, the bias towards action is really damaging, I think. And so there needs to be time for reflection. There needs to be time for inquiry and asking questions of people, and not just keep pushing forward all the time, to create change or to implement something. You know, take a break every now and again.
Yeah, hearing their stories.
Yes, exactly, because otherwise there's no chance to tell them. They're only ever told informally. And you know, leaders and that never get the chance to really hear them.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about scarf a moment ago, and that's very, you know, that's, when you look at it, it's very closely related to things like self-determination theory. There's a reason why, you know, frameworks that are standing the test of time are kind of similar, I suppose. You know, so we work. You know, our work is, you know, draws quite a bit on, you know, the concept of self-determination theory and those basic human needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And when we talk about different concepts, but they're all very closely related to that. So we talk about, you know, belonging, growth, enjoyment, autonomy. So we have six elements of our felt experience. But it's, you know, it's that thing about matching the situation to the, you know, understanding, matching, telling the right kind of story, having the right kind of response. You know, I see all the time, you know, leaders make, and even so-called experts, making big assumptions about how people are going to feel, and then sending out those messages without listening. And that, I suppose, that relates to things like the change curve, and how that is a presupposed route that we take through any journey like that. And it just isn't like that. It's a lot more complex, a lot more messy.
It is. I mean, you know, the change curve just makes me want to bang my head on the table, because it's just it's so prescriptive. I think it's useful in terms of having a set of words that how people might be feeling, but that's all it is. And I think it can make people feel a bit inadequate if they're not progressing along the change curve as they should. And I'm doing inverted commas under my desk while I say that. You know, when I talk about change, I always have it as a really messy curve. So like the beginning point, an end point, and then there's like a massive tangle of wool in the middle. And at some point you'll emerge from the other end. But, you know, it's we shouldn't be making people feel that they have to go along this trajectory of emotion, because some people are really happy with uncertainty and they thrive on it, and some people hate it, and some people are in between, and that's all okay. And as we just need to be all right with that and just accept that people will come out the other end, but for some people it might take longer than others.
Yeah, and I might love it right now and hate it in a slightly different context in an hour's time.
And I reserve my right to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, because I'm a human being.
Exactly.
So we talked about a bunch of things, concepts and tools and things like this, and before we open up to questions, it'd be or any more questions, because we've had some great interaction today. If people want to get started, in using storytelling more deliberately, what would you see? What would you suggest?
So I think there's a few things you can do to get started. You can start to build your understanding of story and what a story looks like. And I think I would encourage people to start looking at their own organisation, look at other organisations, and see if you can get ideas for stories that really grab you, that really engage you. There's a great website called storytest.com, which is run by a company called Anecdotes. They're just fantastic. They do loads of stuff around storytelling. Take a look at their stuff. But you can go on there and read little extracts and see whether they're a story or not. And so I've mentioned already, story has a set of characters, it has a time frame, it has some stuff that happens, and it has some emotion. So you can look at how that structure works and see what's a story and what isn't. I would really encourage people to start building up a little bank of stories that they want to use. And my dear colleague and friend David Lee always recommends having a story database. So just a Word document, a table with 2 columns, and on one side you write a story that interests you, that could be something that's happened to you or something you've heard, and then the other side you put some keywords that you could then tell that story in relation to. And over time you can build up this database of stories that you can then search by keywords. So you think, oh, I'm giving a presentation on X, I want to tell a story, because I don't know about you, but I can't remember sometimes all these stories that I have. And so he told me this a couple of years ago, and it's been a game changer. So I would do that. And as I said already, just start small, start popping in an anecdote every now and again into a presentation that you're giving. Think about visual storytelling. Presentations Then is just a great book around thinking about how you structure slides, you structure pictures, and think about how you're using visual storytelling, and try and encourage people that you're working with to, rather than just standing up and presenting some slides, put their own spin on it. What's exciting to them about this? What are they interested in? Have they got any anecdotes that they can relate and add to it? So, and just keep practicing and have fun with it. It should be fun. Using stories should be fun. So practice in front of a kind audience, get some feedback on what they enjoyed, what they would like to have heard more of, and just start building it into your repertoire, and gradually it becomes just normal, and you'll do it all the time.
Okay, great. Well, does anybody have any, I know we've had some great questions already, but do we have any more questions? Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Nice to see you.
Any questions coming in from the LinkedIn side, Naomi? Maybe? While we're waiting for that, I'm going to just put a link in the panel. There's a long URL which hopefully works, which is a link to your to Change Stories, your Suzanne's podcast, Change Stories, which I've contributed to, so maybe avoid that episode.
It was very good.
But there's also some really interesting and useful episodes on that too. And if that link doesn't work, it's feldsparconsulting.com.
You just go onto your platform and search Change Stories, you should be able to find it.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there are no questions coming in, then I think all that's left to be said is, thank you, Suzanne. Thanks for joining us. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today and asked some great questions and interacted with us.
Thanks, everybody.